Let's talk bog filter plumbing. In this video I want to talk about piping size, plumbing the bog so it's easy to clean, adding a breather pipe so the bog doesn't drain itself when the power goes out, where to position the pond pump that will feed the bog filter, and probably a few other things. G'day, my name is Kev. The aim of my channel is to help people build and maintain ponds without spending a fortune. If that sounds like something that interests you, it's free to subscribe and you might like to check out my website, ozponds.com. Bogs are great filters. This video will focus more on the plumbing. If you want to learn more about bogs and why they're so awesome, I'll link a few of my other videos in the description. There's a few different ways I build a bog filter. Large bogs like this one, I'll often use pond liner to hold the bog. And on smaller bogs, I'll use a container, usually plastic, as it's easier to drill holes for the plumbing. There's a few variations between the plumbing, so I'll talk a little bit about each different design, and then you can take the components you like to create something that works for you. The first thing to note about a bog filter is that it's positioned above the pond. The pump sits inside the pond and pumps water into the bog filter. Then the water passes through the bog filter and returns to the pond via gravity. No matter whether it's a small bog or a big bog, you want the bog above the pond so that the water flows back into the pond. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, and it is possible to create a bog filter inside the pond itself, but it's just much easier to position the filter above the pond. That's not to say it needs to sit directly over the top like this. You can use a stream to convey the water back into the pond, or even just pipework. It depends on the style of pond you wish to create. The size of the pump you use will be determined by the size of the bog filter, and the size of the plumbing will be determined by the size of the pump. So generally we want the bog filter to be at least 10% of the pond volume. This is a good rule for a fish pond that isn't overstocked. Bigger ponds that you might want to take a dip in during summer, you want to increase the bog size. And the same with ponds where you want to keep lots of fish or turtles or maybe even ducks. So whatever size your bog is, I like to take the empty volume and multiply it by 6. That will give me the size of the pump I require to provide a good slow flow through my bog. Once you know the size of the pump, you can work out the size plumbing you'll need. I will generally just order my pump and then plumb it up using the largest size fitting the pump comes with. But if you like to overthink it, this chart will help you work out the size of piping you'll require for the amount of flow of your pump. I will just say that if you're running the plumbing over a long distance because the bog's quite away from the pond, it doesn't hurt to go the next size up to help mitigate friction loss in the pipework. Okay, now that that's sorted, let's get into the nitty-gritty of the bog itself. One of the aims of any bog design should be to trap any fine solid materials that make it through the pump. Therefore, it's important that we add plumbing to the bog in a way that achieves this. We also want to be able to easily clean and flush the bog out. How I do this will vary depending on the size of the bog and the depth. Usually you want to pump the water from the pond into the bottom of the bog. This is one of my larger ones, built using pond liner. The large drainage pipe slows the water velocity and allows the small solid materials to settle out in the bottom of the filter. The vertical pipe gives me access to the base of the filter. That allows me to get the pond vac down there and suck up the buildup of muck. Then on top of the drainage pipe, I stack various sized rock and pebble, starting larger and gradually getting smaller. So this design is great for larger ponds, and it can be scaled to suit pretty much any size. None of these drawings show how to prevent the bog from siphoning back into the pond if the pump shuts off, but I'll talk about that now as we look at two variations I do on container bogs. The first is my bog in a barrel design. That's what's filtering my courtyard pond. Just because the bog is in a barrel doesn't mean it can't be hidden and blend in with the landscape. So the principle of this design is still the same. Water enters the base of the bog, percolates up through different layers of rock and pebble, and then returns to the pond. You'll notice with this design, I have a clean out valve at the base that can easily be opened to flush out the accumulated muck. You'll also notice that as the plumbing enters the bog from the pond, I have an air hole or valve. This will allow air to fill the pipe coming from the pond should the pump shut off. You should also add this to the larger design. Because the bog sits higher than the pond, when the pump shuts off, the water naturally wants to siphon out of the bog and back into the pond. And because the pipework is positioned in the base of the bog, it will siphon all that dirty water back into the pond. When using a container, you'll need to drill out a hole for the clean out and the outflow. To create a watertight seal, I use Uni-Seals. These are excellent for creating watertight seals in round containers like barrels. On square or rectangle containers like this bog, you can use bulkhead fittings. I'll link both Uni-Seals and bulkhead fittings in the description. Just before we move on to the difference in the plumbing for the smaller, shallower container bog, I want to talk about the size of the outflow. The outflow should always be larger than the inflow. This is because the water coming into the bog is under pressure from the pump. As the water percolates up to the surface of the bog, it's only being displaced by the water being pushed into the bog. The water that's under pressure fits inside a smaller area. You'll also most likely add plants to the bog, so you want to ensure that the water can escape very easily. Okay, shallow bog plumbing. This one I call the mini bog filter. I use this on my really small ponds like the wine barrel pond. In this design I have the clean water coming out of the base of the bog. You could also have it coming out of the front if you prefer, just the same as on the bog in a barrel design. But I like it coming out of the base so I don't get too much splashing at the front of the pond where I want to look at the fish. In this design I just use a small pebble, or in this case some aquaponic clay balls. 20mm or 3/4 inch pebble works just as well. I've used a bulkhead fitting to create a watertight seal and a larger diameter pipe with holes drilled in to act as a gravel guard. I then screw a standpipe into the bulkhead fitting to set the water level of the bog. This is how it looks without gravel and no standpipe fitted. The pump sits inside the pond and delivers water into the bog. In this design I don't mind if the water just enters the bog on the surface. This prevents the siphoning. I've tried this design a few ways, and if you want to direct water into the base of the bog you can. You just drill a small hole in the inflow pipe to prevent a siphon if the pump shuts off. But I find because of the standpipe, the small solid materials that the pump sucks up still sink to the bottom of the bog or get trapped in the plant roots. Okay, now the last important thing to talk about is the position of the pump. In this small pond, the pump can sit inside the pond, no problem. As the water splashes into the pond, it adds oxygen to the water. Because the body of water is so small, all the water being sucked up by the pond should be well oxygenated. In larger ponds, it's better to place the pump in a skimmer, intake bay or negative edge. I'll link a video in the description if you aren't sure what that means. Basically, they all pull water off the pond surface into the pump. This prevents things like leaves sinking inside the pond and reduces the amount of maintenance the pond requires. But it also helps send oxygen-rich water directly to the filter. On larger ponds, you also want to position the pumps on the opposite end of the pond to where the clean water enters. This is going to ensure good overall circulation. If you want to see the actual builds of any of my ponds, they're all available if you scroll through the backlog of videos. Anyway, I think I've rambled on enough. I could just keep going. I doubt anyone's made it this far. But if you did, thanks for watching, and I hope you get something out of it. See ya.